She had a scar, a limp, and no one in that town would even glance at her until the richest man in the area walked in, bypassed her beautiful sister, and chose her. But this isn't a sweet love story. This is the story of a woman scorned by the world, fighting alone against the most ruthless enemy in the prairie. And what she does next will ensure the town never forgets her name. Like, comment with the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The town of Redemption Hollow didn't get many strangers. Sitting at the edge of the Bitterroot Valley in Montana Territory, it was the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere better, or landed in when they'd run out of somewhere else to go. The main road was unpaved and mean, churning to mud in spring and cracking to dust in summer. The storefronts leaned into each other like tired men holding each other upright. The saloon did more business than the church, and the church didn't much mind. When Elias Voss rode in on a gray October morning in 1878, he came alone. No wagon, no hired hands trailing behind, no fanfare, just a big roan horse, a bedroll strapped behind the saddle, and a face that gave nothing away. He was broad-shouldered, maybe 40, with dark eyes set under the kind of brow that made people instinctively lower their voices when he walked into a room. His coat was good wool, well cut, the sort of thing that didn't come from a catalog. Money, people decided within the first 10 minutes. Old money, or at least money that had aged well. He stopped at the land office first, which started the rumors. Then the bank, which confirmed them. By the time he ate supper at the Hollow's only boarding house, half the town had already decided what he was doing there and who he ought to be introduced to. Mabel Reardon, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the chief social engineer of Redemption Hollow, set a plate in front of him and didn't waste time. "You looking to buy land or sell it?" she asked. Elias looked up from his stew. "Buy, most likely. There's good land north of town, the Petrie parcels, if you're looking for something already cleared." She refilled his coffee without asking. "But if you want range and water together, you'd want to talk to Gerald Hartwell. He's got the biggest spread in the valley. Runs cattle, or used to." She paused just long enough for the qualifier to land. "His daughter Vivian might be able to arrange an introduction. She's well, you'll see." Elias nodded without committing to anything and went back to his stew. Mabel took that as encouragement enough. Quote, the Hartwell Ranch sat 5 miles east of town, where the valley floor flattened and the grass came in thick and golden before the first hard frost hit. From the ridge you could see the whole spread. The main house, 2 outbuildings, a barn that had seen better decades, and the long curve of Sentinel Creek threading through the south pasture. It was the kind of land that made men understand why other men had killed for it. Gerald Hartwell had inherited it from his father, who'd broken it from raw territory with a pickaxe and pure stubbornness. Gerald had not inherited his father's stubbornness, or much else besides the deed. He was a man who'd been handsome once, in the way of men who peaked early and didn't know it. Now he was soft around the middle, red in the face, and most evenings could be found on the porch with a bottle of rye whiskey and his opinions about what was wrong with everyone else. He had 2 daughters. Vivian was 24 and had the kind of beauty that made men forget what they'd been about to say. Honey-colored hair, green eyes, a smile she deployed with surgical precision. She'd grown up knowing exactly what she looked like and had built her entire understanding of the world around it. She wore her best dress to Sunday services, even when there was no one new in town, on the theory that you never knew. She was not cruel, exactly. She was just a woman who had learned very early that certain things would always be handed to her, and had never had reason to question whether that arrangement would hold. Clara was 27, and 3 years older felt like 30 in the way the world treated her. When she was 11, a horse had thrown her against a fence rail. The fall left a scar that ran from her left jaw down toward her collarbone, pale and slightly raised, impossible to hide. It also did something to her hip that the doctor in Missoula couldn't entirely explain. The joint healed wrong, left her with a hitch in her stride that never fully smoothed out. Not a severe limp, not the kind that required a cane, just enough that people noticed and kept noticing and let it tell them everything they thought they needed to know about her. She was not beautiful, at least not in any way the town of Redemption Hollow had the vocabulary for. She had dark hair she kept pinned back without ceremony, brown eyes that were sharper than comfortable, and hands that were calloused from work that nobody officially acknowledged she was doing. She was the one who got up before the sun. She was the one who knew which sections of the south fence were failing and which cattle were losing weight and what the water level in the creek meant for the dry months ahead. She kept accounts in a ledger her father didn't know she had. She made decisions about the herd that her father believed he'd made himself. Nobody in town thought about Clara Hartwell much. When they did, they thought about the scar first and the limp second, and that was usually where their thinking stopped. Elias came out to the Hartwell Ranch on a Wednesday, which was not a social call kind of day, which was perhaps why he chose it. He came to look at the land, he said. Gerald had agreed to show him around after a letter of introduction came through the bank, and Gerald was always willing to talk about the land even when he couldn't quite bring himself to work it. Vivian appeared on the porch when she heard the horse. She'd had time to change into the green dress, which told Clara that someone had ridden ahead with word. Clara was at the barn, working a loose hinge on the large door, and she watched the arrival from across the yard without stopping what she was doing. Elias dismounted. He shook Gerald's hand. He glanced toward the porch, where Vivian stood with one hand resting on the railing in a pose that was entirely natural and also entirely calculated. He looked for approximately 1 second, the way a man might note a cloud formation before turning his attention back to the horizon. Then he looked toward the barn. Clara went back to the hinge. She heard them before they got to her, her father's voice, louder than necessary, the way it got when he was performing for company. "And this is my daughter Clara. She helps out around the place." She straightened up and faced them. Elias Voss was taller than she'd expected. He looked at her the way she wasn't used to being looked at, directly, without the quick flinch toward the scar that most people couldn't suppress. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Voss." She wiped her hand on her work pants before offering it, which her father would lecture her about later, but her hand was dirty and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Elias shook it without comment. His grip was firm and brief. "What's wrong with the hinge?" he asked. She blinked. "Pin's worn through. I've got a replacement, but the bolt hole's stripped. I'm going to have to rethread it." He looked at the door, then back at her. "You do that yourself?" "I do most things myself." Gerald laughed the uncomfortable laugh of a man who felt a conversation going somewhere he hadn't planned. "Clara's very capable," he said, in a tone that managed to make capability sound like a mild eccentricity. "Shall we look at the north pasture, Mr. Voss?" Elias followed Gerald toward the pasture. But before he turned away, he looked at the hinge one more time, then at Clara, and there was something in his expression she couldn't immediately name. Not pity, not condescension, something more like recognition, though of what, she couldn't say. She went back to the hinge. He came back on Friday. This time he arrived when Gerald was in town, which may or may not have been coincidence. Vivian intercepted him at the gate with a smile and an offer of lemonade. Elias accepted the lemonade and drank about half of it, and then asked where Clara was. Vivian's smile didn't slip. She was too practiced for that. But something shifted behind her eyes. "She'll be in the south pasture," she said. "She likes it out there." It wasn't that she liked it. It was that 3 sections of south fence needed inspection before the next rain, and she was the one who'd noticed and the one who'd do it. But Clara didn't correct people's narratives about her anymore. It cost too much energy and changed too little. She was checking the 3rd section when she heard the horse. She turned to find Elias riding toward her at an easy pace, not hurrying, looking at the fence line with what seemed like genuine interest. "Your sister said you'd be here," he said. "My sister was right." He dismounted and walked the fence beside her, which was strange enough that she kept waiting for him to say something that explained it. He didn't. He just walked and looked at the posts and the wire, and after a few minutes he said, "That post's going to go before spring." She looked where he was pointing. He was right. "I know. I've got it in the ledger." "You keep a ledger for the fence work?" "I keep a ledger for everything. It's the only way to know what you're actually looking at versus what you think you're looking at." She paused. "Most people don't want to know the difference." He was quiet for a moment. A meadow lark called from somewhere in the grass. "How long has the ranch been losing money?" he asked. The directness of it was startling enough that she answered honestly before she could decide whether to. 3 years of real losses. Before that, 2 years of breaking even when we should have been building reserves. The drought in '74 took more than my father admits. And the debt? Enough. She looked at him. Why are you asking me instead of him? Elias looked at the fence post that was going to fail before spring. Because I asked him last Wednesday, and he told me the ranch was in fine shape. Clara didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to that. What would it take, Elias said, to get ahead of it? Not recover, not survive, actually get ahead. She had the answer ready because she'd been working through it in her ledger for 2 years. She hadn't told anyone because there was no one to tell. She laid it out for him standing by a failing fence post in the south pasture. The cattle she'd sell, the acreage she'd lease out, the repairs that had to happen in what order, the sections of creek she'd redirect to improve the summer pasture. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look at her scar. When she finished, he said, "That's a solid plan." "It's a good plan," she said with a small edge she didn't entirely intend. "There's a difference." He looked at her then, and the corner of his mouth moved in what might have been a smile. "You're right," he said. "It's a good plan." She looked away first because the directness of his attention was something she wasn't built for. Nobody paid that kind of attention to Clara Hartwell. It made her suspicious and flustered in equal measure, and she didn't enjoy either feeling. The town, meanwhile, had reached its own conclusions. Elias Voss was seen riding out to the Hartwell Ranch 3 times in 1 week, and by the 3rd time, Redemption Hollow had written the entire story in its head. Vivian Hartwell and the wealthy stranger. It was perfect, people said. Vivian was exactly the kind of woman a man like that would want. Beautiful, well-mannered, the right last name in this valley. Mabel Reardon said as much over the counter at the dry goods store. Hector Flynn, who owned the saloon, gave 3-to-1 odds and found no takers. Nobody thought about Clara. Why would they? She was out in the pastures somewhere, doing whatever it was she did. She'd been invisible so long the town had stopped even registering her as a possibility. Vivian noticed Elias noticing Clara and said nothing about it. She was too smart for a direct confrontation and too proud to acknowledge that a man had looked past her. She turned her attention up by degrees, better dresses, more deliberate appearances at the gate when Elias was due to arrive, more lemonade, more careful conversation about things she thought a man like him would want to discuss. She wasn't wrong that most men would have responded. She just hadn't met many men like Elias. "You like him," Vivian said to Clara one evening. Not a question. Clara was mending a bridle by the lamp. She didn't look up. "I don't know him well enough to like him." "You like talking to him." That was true enough that denying it would have been obvious. He asks good questions. Vivian was quiet for a moment, which was more unsettling than if she'd said something sharp. "He'll leave," she said finally. "Men like that always decide they want something else." Clara set down the bridle. "I know that." "I'm just saying." I know what you're saying, Vivian." The silence between them was the kind that had years of history compressed into it. Years of Vivian being chosen first and Clara watching from the back of the room. Years of their father praising Vivian's beauty with the same breath he dismissed Clara's usefulness. Years of a dynamic so baked into the household that neither of them could see around it anymore. Clara picked the bridle back up. The lamp guttered slightly in a draft from the window. "He's not interested in me that way," Clara said. "He's interested in the land. He's deciding whether to invest." Vivian went to bed without answering. Clara didn't quite believe what she'd just said, but she'd said it convincingly, and that would have to be enough. On the following Tuesday, Elias sat across from Gerald Hartwell at the kitchen table and made an offer, not to buy the ranch, but to inject capital in exchange for a working partnership. He would fund specific improvements. The Hartwells would maintain ownership. They'd split the profit on the improved yield for 3 years, after which the arrangement could be renegotiated. Gerald listened with his fingers wrapped around a glass he hadn't filled yet, which was his version of paying close attention. When Elias finished, Gerald said, "That's an interesting proposition." "It's a fair one," Elias said, "for both sides." "Who would manage the capital, the improvements, I mean? Who's deciding what gets done and when?" Elias looked at him steadily. "I'd want Clara overseeing the operations side. She knows the land." Gerald's expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise, then something like embarrassment, then the carefully arranged neutrality of a man who doesn't want to admit he's been surprised. Clara, he said. She's got the most complete understanding of what the ranch needs. I've talked to her about it. Her plan is sound. She's a good girl, Gerald said, which was the thing men said when they meant something else and couldn't quite get there. I just thought, the operational decisions? That's more. She's already making the operational decisions, Elias said. Not unkind, not accusing, just factual, in the way of a man who had looked at what was actually in front of him. Gerald picked up his glass, set it down without drinking. I suppose she does know it better than most, he said at last. From the doorway, where she'd been passing through and had stopped without deciding to, Clara stood still enough not to make a sound. She'd heard it. She stood there another moment, then walked quietly back toward the barn, where she had a fence ledger to update, and a list of repairs that was 3 pages long and had never once been asked for by anyone who could do anything about it. Until now. She stood at the barn door in the afternoon light and looked out at the south pasture and the long curve of the creek, and she thought about the plan she'd carried in her head for 2 years and in her ledger for 1. And she thought about the failing fence post that Elias Voss had spotted at 20 yards and named without any ceremony, and she thought about how it felt to have someone ask the right questions and then actually listen to the answers. It felt dangerous. That was the honest word for it. Not good, not hopeful, dangerous. The way a thing felt when you'd learned not to want it and then found yourself wanting it anyway. The creek caught the late sun and threw it back in pieces across the grass. Clara went inside to get her ledger. There was work to plan. The partnership agreement was signed on a Thursday, which meant by Friday morning the entire town of Redemption Hollow knew about it and had opinions. Most of those opinions were about the wrong things. People talked about the money, how much Elias Voss was putting in, whether Gerald Hartwell had negotiated well or been taken advantage of, whether the ranch could actually be turned around, or whether it was throwing good capital after bad. Mabel Reardon revised her theory about Vivian and Elias twice before noon and arrived at the conclusion that men of wealth were simply unpredictable, and she stood by that. Nobody talked about Clara, because the news that reached town was Gerald Hartwell's version of events, and in Gerald's version, he had struck a shrewd deal with an outside investor and was overseeing the improvements personally. Clara heard her father's version secondhand from a ranch hand named Pete Doyle, who'd been in the feed store when Gerald was holding court. Pete told her with the careful expression of a man delivering news he wasn't sure how to frame. He'd worked the Hartwell Ranch for 6 years. He knew who actually ran it. Your father's telling people he's the one managing the operation, Pete said. Clara was marking measurements on a fence post. She didn't stop. I know. Does it bother you? She considered the question with more honesty than she usually offered. It would bother me more if the work didn't get done. Pete nodded slowly, the way people did when they weren't entirely satisfied with an answer but recognized the argument inside it. He went back to his digging. Claire went back to her measurements. The work started the following Monday. Elias arrived before sunup with 2 hired men from Missoula, a carpenter named Abe, who was built like a wardrobe and spoke about 4 words a day, and a younger man called Denny, who talked enough to cover for both of them. They brought materials in a wagon, good lumber, wire fencing, hardware, a replacement water pump that Clara had specified and Elias had sourced without asking for her justification twice. That last part still surprised her, 3 days in. She'd given him the list expecting negotiation. With her father, any request above $1 required a defense. Elias had read through it, asked 2 clarifying questions, and ordered everything on it. It was so uncomplicated that she'd spent a day waiting for some other kind of catch. By the 2nd week of November, the south fence line was rebuilt, the pump was installed, and the barn door that had been hanging wrong for 8 months finally opened and closed like it was supposed to. Small things, but the ranch ran on small things. The small things added up to whether cattle lost weight or held it, whether a dry summer killed you or just hurt. Elias worked alongside the hired men most days, which Clara hadn't expected. She'd assumed he'd oversee and delegate, the way men with money generally preferred. Instead, he showed up in work clothes and did the physical labor without announcing that he was doing it. He didn't seem to need credit for it. That was the rarest thing about him, she'd decided. Most men who did something useful wanted you to notice. Elias appeared constitutionally indifferent to being noticed, except when he was watching her work. She'd caught him doing it twice, not in any way that felt intrusive, more like a man trying to solve a problem he found interesting. She didn't know what to do with it, so she ignored it, which was her standard approach to things she didn't know what to do with. "You ever going to let someone help you?" he said one afternoon. She was restringing a section of wire by herself, which would have been faster with a second pair of hands. She hadn't asked. "I know how to do it," she said. "I didn't say you didn't." She kept working. He held the post steady without being invited to, and they finished the section in half the time. He didn't say anything about it afterward, neither did she. It became a pattern. Him finding the place where her stubbornness was costing her time and stepping into it without making a production of it. She resented it for about a week, and then she stopped resenting it because the work was getting done faster, and the work was the point. What wasn't part of the pattern, what she couldn't fold into the practical logic of it, was how the days had started to feel different, not easier, just less like she was holding everything up by herself. She noticed it the way you notice a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot it was heavy. Only when someone helped you set it down for a moment did you understand what it had cost you to carry it. She didn't say any of that. She wrote it down in a different part of the ledger, in the back, in handwriting smaller than her accounting entries. Then she thought about what she'd written, decided it was foolish, and closed the ledger. It was Pete Doyle who first mentioned Marcus Crowley. He brought it up on a cold morning in late November, when the frost was still heavy on the grass and the sky had the flat white look that meant serious weather was thinking about arriving. He and Clara were moving the herd to the north section, where the creek ran closer to the shelter of the tree line. "Crowley's men were riding the east boundary yesterday," Pete said. "Two of them, just sitting there looking." Clara glanced at him. "Looking at what?" "The creek, mostly, the way it runs off the south pasture." She knew Crowley's name. Everybody in the valley knew it. Marcus Crowley had spent the better part of 15 years acquiring land between the Bitterroot and the Sapphire Ranges, buying what he could, pressuring what he couldn't buy, and occasionally doing things that were harder to categorize but easier to understand if you knew what kind of man he was. He was not from Montana originally. He had the manner of someone who'd arrived somewhere and immediately begun calculating how to own it. The Hartwell Ranch had something Crowley wanted, and Clara had understood that for 2 years without entirely knowing what to do about it. The creek, Sentinel Creek, was the only reliable water source in the lower valley that didn't dry to a trickle by August. In a drought year, it was the difference between a viable cattle operation and a dead one. Crowley's land to the east had grass, but not enough water. He'd been managing around it, but managing around it had limits. She told Elias that evening. They were in the small room off the kitchen that Gerald called his office, but hadn't used for actual paperwork in 3 years. Clara had repurposed it as her workspace, her ledgers, her land maps, a survey she'd had done the previous spring out of her own savings. Elias sat across from her, looking at the survey map. "He's been watching the creek," she said. His men were on the east boundary. Elias studied the map without speaking for a moment. "Has he approached your father before?" "Once, last spring." She hesitated. "My father didn't tell me. I found out from Pete. Crowley came to the house when I was in town and made some kind of offer. My father apparently told him it wasn't for sale." "Apparently." "My father is... he doesn't handle pressure well." She said it flatly, without venom. It was just the fact of it. "If Crowley pushes hard enough and my father has enough whiskey in him, I don't know what he'd agree to." Elias looked at her. "Does your father know what the creek is actually worth?" "I don't think he's thought about it in those terms. He thinks about it as a feature of the land, not as a resource someone else would pay to control." She traced the line of the creek on the map with her finger. "If Crowley ever gets access to this water, he doesn't need to buy anything else east of the Bitterroot. He can consolidate the whole lower valley. Every small rancher between here and the county line becomes dependent on him." The room was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it working at the corner of the roof where a piece of flashing had come loose. She'd put that on the list, but it hadn't risen to the top yet. "How much do you know about how he operates?" Elias said. "Enough. A rancher named Gus Feller sold to him 2 years ago, or the story is he sold. People who knew Gus said the sale happened right after his prize bull turned up dead, and 2 of his hands quit the same week. No one could prove anything. No one tried. The county sheriff and Marcus Crowley went to school together," Clara said. That's as much as you need to know about whether anyone tried. Elias sat back in the chair. He had an expression she'd started to recognize, not calculating exactly, but focused, the way a man looked when he was running numbers on something that didn't involve money. "We need to know if he's already been back to your father," he said. "Yes." "Will your father tell you the truth if you ask?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind hit the roof again. "He'll tell me what he thinks I want to hear," she said at last, which isn't the same thing. She asked her father the next morning over breakfast, directly, while Vivian was still upstairs. Gerald Hartwell had the tell of a man who'd been drinking the night before. He moved carefully, like he was trying not to disturb something, and he was overly attentive to his coffee cup. "Has Crowley's people been by again?" Clara asked. Gerald looked at his coffee. "What makes you ask that?" "Pete saw 2 of his riders on the east boundary. I want to know if there's been contact." "I handle the business side of things," Gerald said with a dignity that would have been more convincing if his hands were steadier. "Papa," she kept her voice even, "I need to know." He was quiet long enough that she had her answer before he gave it. "A man came by last week," he said finally. "One of Crowley's men. Delivered a letter." "Offering to buy?" "Offering to lease the water rights, just for summer months," he said. "Said it was good income for not much inconvenience." Gerald turned the coffee cup in his hands. "It was a generous number." Clara looked at him. "You didn't sign anything." No, I didn't. I said I needed to think about it." He looked up then, and she saw in his face the thing she always saw when she looked at him directly. The man who could have been something, wrapped inside the man who'd given up on finding out what. "Clara, if the number is right, if we lease the water rights and Crowley's cattle are on that creek all summer, our herd won't have priority access to the lower pasture water. We lose weight on 50 head minimum. We lose this summer's calves on the south section." She kept her voice measured, because losing her temper with him never accomplished anything. "He's not offering to lease water rights. He's offering to make us dependent on his goodwill." Gerald was quiet. "Don't answer the letter," she said. "Not yet. Give me 2 weeks." 2 weeks for what? "To figure out what we're actually dealing with." He looked like he was going to push back, and then he didn't. That was the thing about her father. He had less fight in him every year, which was useful when she needed him not to do something stupid, and devastating when she needed him to stand for something. She brought all of it to Elias that afternoon. He listened the way he always listened, without rushing her, without offering solutions before she'd finished laying out the problem. She'd told him once, half to herself, that it was unusual for a man to hear you out before deciding he already knew what you meant. He'd said that hearing people out was just efficient because the alternative wasted everyone's time. She'd laughed at that, which startled them both a little. "If Crowley sends someone else," Elias said, "it won't be a letter. It'll be pressure of a different kind." "I know." "Your father needs to understand what he'd be selling." "My father understands in the morning and forgets by evening," Clara said, and there was a tired edge to it that she didn't bother to file off. "I'm not saying that to be cruel. It's just what's true." Elias looked at her for a moment. "What does Vivian think about all this?" The question caught her off guard. She thought about it honestly. "Vivian thinks the ranch is a problem someone else should have to solve," she said. "She didn't choose this life. She just happened to be born into it. She wants something easier." "And you?" Clara looked out the window at the south pasture, brown now under the November sky, the creek a dark line through the pale grass. "I didn't choose it either," she said. "I just can't leave it." There was a difference between those two things, and she'd never tried to put it into words before. It sat in the air between them for a moment. "Then we don't let Crowley have it," Elias said. It was not a declaration exactly. He said it the way he said most things, matter-of-factly, like it was simply the next logical step. But there was something in the plainness of it that landed harder than any speech would have. "We." She noticed the word and didn't say anything about it. "No," she said. "We don't." Oh. December arrived and Crowley made his next move in a way none of them expected. He didn't send another letter. He came to town. He appeared at the Redemption Hollow Saloon on a Tuesday evening, just himself and one man, and he had drinks with Hector Flynn and talked loudly enough about the valley's future that the conversation traveled through the walls and down the street before he was halfway through his first glass. He was a tall man, lean in the way of people who are careful about everything, with pale eyes and the kind of manners that made the rougher men in the saloon sit up slightly straighter without knowing why. He talked about water rights in general terms, about investment and development, about what the lower valley could look like with proper infrastructure. He named no names. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room understood what land he was talking about and whose it was. Word reached Clara the next morning, again through Pete, who had a cousin who'd been in the saloon. She listened to the report and then went to find Elias, who was replacing boards on the north fence line. "He's not just pressuring my father," she said. "He's shaping the story in town. By the time he makes his real move, people will already think it's the natural order of things." Elias drove a nail without missing the head. "He's good at this," he said. "He's had a lot of practice." Elias set the hammer down and looked at her. "I've met men like Crowley. They rely on other people not paying attention. They do the work in the spaces where no one's watching." He paused. "We need to be watching." "We are." "No, I mean the water source, the actual spring that feeds the creek. If Crowley's men know where it originates, and your family doesn't have that in any legal document, he can make a case for access that doesn't need your father's signature." Clara stared at him. The cold morning air sat still around them, and somewhere in the tree line a crow called once and went quiet. She knew exactly where the spring was. She'd known since she was a child. It sat at the base of a limestone shelf on the eastern edge of the property, tucked into a fold in the land that wasn't visible from the main access road. She'd never thought about it in legal terms because she'd never thought about anyone challenging their right to it. It was just part of the land. It was just where the water came from. "It's not in the deed survey," she said. It wasn't a question. She already knew. "It might not matter," Elias said. "Or it might matter a great deal, depending on what Crowley's lawyer argues." She turned and looked east toward the fold in the landscape she couldn't see from here but could picture exactly. The limestone shelf, the dark seam of the spring, the way the water came up clear and cold even in August, when everything else around it was gasping. "I need to get a surveyor out there," she said. "I already know one in Missoula. He can be here in 10 days. She looked at him. "You thought about this before I did." "I thought about it differently," he said. "You know the land. I know what men like Crowley do to land they want." It should have irritated her that he'd been a step ahead. Instead, she felt something that was almost relief. The specific relief of not being the only person in the room thinking 3 moves forward. She'd been playing that game alone for 2 years, and it was exhausting in a way she'd never admitted to anyone, not even in the back pages of her ledger. 10 days, she said. 10 days? He confirmed, and picked up his hammer again. She stood there another moment in the cold, looking east, thinking about the spring she'd drunk from as a girl, the way it tasted different from creek water, colder, cleaner, carrying something from deep in the rock. She thought about Crowley's pale eyes and his careful manners and the way he'd made his move in public, in front of witnesses, shaping the story before anyone knew there was a story being told. She thought about her father sitting with a generous number on a piece of paper, turning it over, wanting the easy thing. She thought about Vivian, who wanted a different life, and who Clara couldn't entirely blame for that, even now. The crow called again from the tree line, and this time didn't stop. Clara pulled her coat tighter and walked back toward the barn, because there was still half a day of work left and the cattle in the north section needed checking, and the list never got shorter on its own. Some things hadn't changed, but the ground under them had shifted just slightly in ways she was still learning to map. The surveyor from Missoula arrived on a Thursday, a wiry man named Caldwell, who smelled like pipe tobacco and asked no unnecessary questions, which Clara appreciated. She walked the eastern boundary with him herself, through the frozen grass and over the limestone shelf, and showed him the spring without explaining why it mattered. He measured and mapped and staked and left 3 days later with a fee that came out of Elias's pocket and a promise to have the legal documents filed in Helena within the fortnight. Gerald Hartwell didn't ask about the surveyor. Clara had mentioned it once, briefly, and he'd nodded in the way of a man who has decided to trust that someone else is handling the difficult parts. She didn't push him for more engagement. She'd learned long ago that her father's participation in things he didn't understand usually made them harder, not easier. Vivian asked more pointed questions. "That man was out there for 3 days," she said one evening, appearing in the kitchen doorway while Clara was going over the survey notes. "What exactly is Elias having mapped?" "The eastern boundary, the spring." "What does it cost?" "Elias is covering it." Vivian was quiet in a way that had weight to it. She came into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water and stood at the counter with the glass held in both hands, which was something she did when she was thinking carefully about something she wasn't going to say directly. Clara had known that gesture since they were children. "He spends a lot of money on this ranch," Vivian said. "It's a partnership. He has a financial interest." "He has an interest in more than the finances," Vivian said, and her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, stripped of any accusation, which somehow made it worse than accusation. "I see how he looks at you, Clara. I'm not blind." Clara looked at her survey notes. "You're seeing what you want to see." "Maybe," Vivian set her glass down, "or maybe you're not seeing what you don't want to." She went upstairs without waiting for an answer. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, not looking at the survey notes anymore, listening to the wind work at the loose flashing on the roof that she still hadn't gotten to. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself to focus on what was in front of her. The spring, the survey, Crowley's next move, the cattle weights, the list of repairs that never got shorter. She told herself these things with the methodical stubbornness of a woman who had learned that feelings were a luxury you didn't spend when there was work to be done. She believed most of it. Not all of it, but most. Crowley made his real move in January, and he didn't bother with subtlety. He sent his foreman, a man named Birch, to the Hartwell house on a Monday morning with a formal offer in an envelope. Not a letter this time, but a legal document prepared by a lawyer in Missoula, offering to purchase the water rights to the spring and Sentinel Creek outright for a number that made Gerald go very still when he read it. Clara was in the barn when Birch arrived. By the time she knew about it and got to the house, Birch was already leaving, and Gerald was sitting at the kitchen table with the envelope open in front of him and the expression of a man trying to do mathematics he didn't have the tools for. "Don't sign it," Clara said, before she'd even taken her coat off. "I haven't signed anything." Gerald didn't look up. "But Clara, this number is designed to make you feel like you'd be foolish not to take it." She pulled the document toward herself and read it quickly, scanning the legal language for what was buried in it. It took her about 2 minutes to find the clause. "Here, once he has the water rights, this language gives him the right to regulate access during periods of operational necessity. That means he decides when our cattle drink from this creek. He doesn't need to buy the land, he just needs to own the water." Gerald rubbed his face with both hands. He looked old in the winter light, older than he'd looked in the fall, like the season had taken something from him. "I'm tired, Clara," he said. "I've been tired for a long time." "I know." "Maybe selling isn't the worst thing. Maybe we take the money and what?" She kept her voice level. "And Crowley controls the only water in the lower valley, and every rancher east of the Bitterroot is at his mercy, including us, because we'll still need creek access for the south pasture even after we've sold the rights. And there's nothing in here that guarantees us anything. He can price us out in the first dry summer." She folded the document and slid it back toward him. "This isn't a buyout. It's a trap with a number on it." Gerald looked at the document. He looked at his hands. 2 more weeks, Clara said. "Give me 2 more weeks." She went to find Elias. He was at the north fence, where Denny was finishing the last of the winter reinforcements. Clara told him about the document while they walked the fence line, fast enough that she covered the important points before her own frustration could get ahead of the facts. He listened without stopping her, and when she finished, he said, "The survey is filed. Caldwell sent confirmation yesterday. I was going to tell you tonight." She felt the relief move through her before she could stop it. "So the spring is on record?" As Hartwell property clearly bounded with a formal description that preempts any claim of ambiguity. He paused. "That doesn't mean Crowley stops. It means his legal route is closed, which means he'll try something else." "What else?" He looked at her. "I don't know yet. That's what concerns me." She'd been thinking about Gus Feller and his bull that turned up dead. She'd been thinking about the 2 ranch hands who quit the same week. small pressures that added up to one large surrender. "He'll come at my father again," she said, "directly, this time." "Yes, or he'll come at something your father values." She thought about what Gerald Hartwell valued, and it was a shorter list than it should have been. His land, nominally. His sense of himself as a man who'd held on to what his father built. His whiskey, more honestly. And his daughters, both of them, though he expressed it badly and inconsistently. She thought about Vivian standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water held in both hands, asking careful questions about how much money Elias spent on the ranch. She pushed the thought away. It was ungenerous. Vivian was difficult and self-interested, but she wouldn't. Clara pushed it away and went back to work. The barn burned on the second Friday in February. It started sometime after midnight, when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made the wood of the buildings contract and groan. Clara woke to the smell first, smoke threading under the door of her room, and then to the orange light in the window that meant it was already too late to save the structure. She was out of bed and into her boots before she was fully awake. She hit the porch to find the barn already going hard, fire climbing the north wall and catching the roof joists, the whole thing lit against the black sky in a way that was almost beautiful and utterly terrible. The horses were screaming. She didn't think. She ran. The barn door was hot to the touch, but not yet impassable. She got it open and went in, eyes burning, and moved by memory through the smoke to the first stall. Her mare, Roan, was wild-eyed and rearing. Clara got a hold of the halter and talked to her, not words exactly, just sound, low and continuous, and got her out and toward the yard. Then back in for the gelding. Then the two workhorses from the far stalls, one of which put a shoulder into her and knocked her against the wall hard enough that she bit through her lip and tasted blood, but she got hold of the lead and hauled. Pete Doyle arrived by the third horse, pulling on his suspenders and running from the bunkhouse. Then Denny. Between the three of them, they cleared the horses and the two milk cows. They couldn't get to the tack room. The south wall went while Clara was still inside, and Pete grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the door over her protest. By the time Elias arrived from the small house up the road where he'd been staying since December, the barn was fully engaged. There was nothing to do about the structure. What they had to do was stop the cattle. The fire sound had spooked the herd in the north pasture. Clara could hear them from the yard, the low, agitated noise that meant they were bunching and pushing, which in a night this dark with firelight behind them could turn into a drift toward the creek bank. And the creek bank on the north end had a steep drop that had taken two calves the previous spring. She didn't explain all of this. She just started running for the north pasture gate, and she was already climbing the fence when Elias caught up. "Where are you going?" he said. "North pasture. They'll go for the bank." He looked at the pasture, at the dark mass of cattle moving at its far edge. "That's 120 yards in the dark." "I know the ground." She dropped to the other side of the fence. "Get Pete and the lanterns." She moved through the pasture at a pace that wasn't quite a run. Her hip didn't allow a full run on uneven ground in the dark, and she'd learned to move fast within what her body would actually do rather than against it. She knew every dip and rock in this field. She'd walked it in worse conditions. She could hear the herd ahead of her, the restless shuffling and lowing, the specific sound of animals that hadn't panicked yet but were close to it. The creek bank was maybe 60 yards beyond the far fence. She needed to turn the lead animals before the back pressure from the rest of the herd pushed them over it. She got to the edge of the herd and did the thing she'd learned from watching her father's father do it before the whiskey had taken everything useful from Gerald. She moved along their flank, not at them, not chasing, just a presence at the shoulder pushing them to turn rather than run. It was angles, mostly. You made yourself into a wall in one direction and let them think they were moving freely in another. It was working, mostly. The herd was turning back east when three things happened close together. Her boot caught the edge of a frozen rut, and her hip twisted wrong, dropping her to one knee. The lead steer decided the dark shape on the ground was more frightening than whatever was behind him and bolted, and about 30 animals followed him at a dead run toward the creek. Clara did not think about her hip. She got up and ran after them. She hit the far side of the herd and cut left, moving ahead of the lead steer in the dark, and she had maybe 10 seconds before the bank. She did the thing she'd been doing since she was 15, the sharp crack of sound from the back of her throat that her grandfather had called the stop whistle, a specific pitch and force that she'd never explained to anyone because there was no good way to explain it. It was just something she'd discovered in herself and refined for years. She gave it everything she had. The lead steer stopped. The animals behind him hit him, jostled, milled. She got between them and the bank and held the position, arms out, making herself as large as she could in the dark, talking that low, continuous sound. The herd pushed and shuffled and stopped about 8 feet from the drop. She stood there breathing hard, hip radiating, lip still bleeding, and didn't move until she heard Pete's lantern coming behind her. "Lord Almighty," Pete said. He took in the herd, the bank where she was standing. "Are you... Your face is bleeding." "I know." She didn't lower her arms until Pete got to her left and Denny to her right, making a line. "Let's push them back east, slow." They worked the herd back across the pasture by lantern light, which took the better part of an hour. Clara's hip was bad enough by the end that she was limping more noticeably than usual. The hitch in her stride lengthened into something that cost her real concentration to manage. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did Pete or Denny. Elias was at the fence when they came back. He'd gotten the remaining fire under control. Barn was gone, but he'd organized a bucket line from the hand pump and stopped the spread to the outbuildings. His coat was soaked and dark with smoke. He looked at Clara coming through the gate, the way she was moving, and she could see him taking inventory the same way she'd take inventory of a piece of fence, noting what held and what hadn't. "The herd's okay," she said. "I can see that." He waited until Pete and Denny had passed. "How's the hip?" "It'll be fine," the standard answer. "That's not what I asked." She stopped walking. "It hurts. It'll hurt less tomorrow." She met his eyes. "The cattle are fine. That's what matters tonight." He looked at her for a moment in the way that still made her uncomfortable, that direct, unsentimental attention that somehow managed to see through the standard answers. Then he nodded. "Come inside. Your lip needs to be looked at. I need to check on the horses first." "Denny's with the horses. Come inside." She went inside because her hip was genuinely bad, and her lip had soaked through the sleeve she'd pressed against it, and because she recognized when she'd hit the limit of what stubbornness could accomplish. Gerald was in the kitchen, white-faced and shaking, which she recognized as shock rather than anything requiring a response. Vivian was seated across from him with a lamp burning, and she looked up when Clara came in. Something moved through Vivian's face that Clara didn't have the energy to read. Elias found bandage cloth in the kitchen cabinet and handed it to Clara without trying to do it for her, which she appreciated. She sat at the table and pressed it to her lip while he built the fire back up. "It was set," Elias said. He set it to the room, not to any one person. The north wall started it. There was no stove in the north section, and it didn't start from the loft. Someone set it. Gerald made a sound. "We don't know that," Vivian said. Her voice was careful. "Old barns catch all the time. The cold, the hay." "Not from the north wall," Clara said. "There's no heat source on the north wall." Vivian looked at the table. Clara looked at her sister. Vivian was dressed, she realized. Not in a robe, not thrown on. Actually dressed, coat folded over the chair back beside her, like someone who'd been outside recently and come in. Clara noticed it and then told herself she was wrong. She was tired. She was looking for a reason behind something terrible because it was easier than accepting that terrible things happened without reason. She held the cloth to her lip and looked at the lamp and tried to believe her own explanation. She almost managed it. The morning after the fire, Clara walked the burned footprint of the barn with Elias and Pete, looking at what remained. The structure was total loss. Only the stone foundation and the iron hardware of the stalls survived. The smell of it was the smell of things that couldn't be replaced, layered over the chemical bite of burnt manure and scorched wood. Pete found the accelerant point at the base of the north wall. Not proof in any legal sense, just a scatter pattern in the ash that didn't match how old timber burned naturally. He'd grown up in a family of loggers and knew fire. He showed Clara without saying anything extra about it, and she looked at it and nodded and didn't say anything extra either. Elias was the one who said it, standing at the burned wall with his hands in his coat pockets. "This was a message." "Yes," Clara said. "Crowley won't stop with a message." "No." Pete kicked at the ash with his boot, turned something over, moved on. The sky above them was the white of snow coming, Still a day or two out, but definitely coming. The horses were in the south corral, the cows in the east pen, the cattle in the north pasture. Everything that had been in the barn was gone. Half the winter tack, 200 pounds of feed, tools she'd been accumulating and maintaining for 6 years, a bridle that had been her grandfather's and that she'd kept oiled and usable, and that was now ash. She wasn't going to think about the bridle right now. "He wants to panic us," she said. "He wants my father to see the damage and decide the number on that legal document looks better than it did a week ago." "He'll go back to your father," Elias said. "Soon." "I know." She turned away from the burned wall. "I need to think." She walked the south pasture for an hour by herself, which was how she thought best. Movement and open ground, and the particular quality of silence that came from a large, cold sky. Her hip was sore enough that the walk was not comfortable, but discomfort had never been a reason she'd accepted for standing still, and she wasn't going to accept it now. She thought about the spring, legally recorded now, which closed one door. She thought about Crowley and the saloon, shaping the story. She thought about the fire at the north wall and what Pete had found in the ash. She thought about her father and the number on the legal document and his tired face in the winter light. She thought about Vivian, sitting dressed at the kitchen table in the middle of the night. That thought wouldn't stay away the way she kept telling it to. She stood at the edge of the south pasture where the creek ran dark through the frozen grass, and she thought about what it meant to build something and what it cost to lose it and what kind of person set a fire in the night to take what wasn't theirs. The creek ran on. The sky pressed lower. Somewhere behind her, the ruins of the barn cooled in the winter air. Clara stood there until she had the beginning of something that might be a plan, and then she went back to find Elias because some things she couldn't do alone, and she was learning, slowly and against her nature, that knowing that was not the same as being weak. The plan came together in pieces, the way most real plans did. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in segments that had to be fitted against each other until the shape of the thing emerged. Clara laid it out for Elias the morning after her walk, at the kitchen table before anyone else in the house was awake. She'd been up since 4 working through the specifics, and by the time she heard Elias's knock at the back door, she had it down to a single page of notes in her smallest handwriting. He read it without interrupting. Outside, the sky was the pale gray of early light, and the snow that had been threatening for 2 days had finally started. Small flakes, dry and fine, the kind that meant serious accumulation before it was done. "You'd be exposed on the ridge," he said when he finished. "I know the ridge. I've shot from there." He looked up. "You've shot from there." "Since I was 16. She held his gaze. "My grandfather taught me. He used to say a rifle was the one tool that worked the same regardless of who was holding it." Elias looked at her for a moment in a way she'd come to recognize, recalibrating, adjusting the model he'd built of her against new information. He did it quickly and without visible surprise, which was one of the things she'd come to respect about him. Most people, when they discovered something about Clara Hartwell that didn't fit their expectations, either dismissed it or made too much of it. Elias just updated what he knew and moved on. "How good?" he said. "Good enough." "Clara." She set down her coffee. "I've taken running deer at 200 yards. The ridge to the spring approach is 160, maybe 170 in the worst section. It's not a hard shot." He was quiet for a moment. "How long since you've done it?" 18 months. She didn't look away from him. "I'll need a morning of practice before we do this. The rifle I have is my grandfather's Remington. It's accurate, but it has a specific pull that takes getting used to." He nodded, slowly, but he nodded. "All right, walk me through the rest of it." She walked him through it. Denny and Pete positioned before dawn. Elias at the creek crossing where it narrowed. The lookout point on the east trail to give them 15 minutes of warning. And Clara on the ridge with the Remington, able to cover the spring approach from a position that Crowley's men wouldn't expect because nobody who'd seen Clara Hartwell walk across a yard would think to look for her on a rifle ridge. That was the part of the plan she didn't say out loud, but they both understood it. "The goal isn't to kill anyone," she said. "It's to stop them, turn them back. Crowley needs to understand that this piece of land is not worth what it will cost him." "And if they don't turn back?" She met his eyes. Then we'll deal with what comes next when it comes. The harder conversation happened 2 hours later, and it had nothing to do with Crowley. She found the evidence in Vivian's room, not by searching, she would say that to herself for the rest of her life, not by searching, but by accident, by reaching into the wrong coat when Vivian asked her to fetch a shawl before going out to the stable. The note was folded in the inside pocket, and it fell when Clara pulled the shawl free, and she picked it up and read it before she understood what she was reading. It was in a man's handwriting she didn't recognize, but the name at the bottom was one she recognized immediately. Birch, Crowley's foreman. The note was not long. It confirmed a meeting time and a location and referenced the information Vivian had apparently already provided about the spring's exact position and the patrol patterns of the ranch hands. In exchange for which, the note confirmed, there would be arrangements made as discussed. Clara stood in Vivian's room with the note in her hand and the snow coming down outside the window and a feeling moving through her that was too large and too complicated to name. She thought about the fire. She thought about Vivian sitting dressed at the kitchen table in the middle of the night. She thought about every careful question Vivian had asked about the survey, the water rights, the eastern boundary. She thought about Vivian wanting a different life and not blaming her for it, and finding out now what that wanting had cost. She sat down on the edge of Vivian's bed because her legs felt unreliable. She sat there for 5 minutes, maybe 10, and then she folded the note and put it in her own pocket and went to find Elias. She gave him the note without explanation. He read it. His expression didn't change much. A tightening around the jaw, a stillness in the eyes. When he looked up at her, she was looking at the wall. "How much does she know?" he said. The spring location, which she could have shown them on a map, the patrol schedule, probably the fence gaps, depending on how many conversations she heard. Clara's voice was flat in a way that took effort. "She knows this property as well as I do. She grew up here." "Does she know about the plan?" "No." She turned to look at him. "I haven't told anyone but you and Pete. Denny doesn't know the full shape of it." He handed the note back. She put it in her pocket. "She won't be here when this happens," Clara said. "I'll make sure of it. Clara, she's my sister." It was not a defense of Vivian. It was a statement of a fact that complicated everything and changed the available responses. I'll make sure she's not here. After it's done, that's a different conversation." Elias looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't tell what he was thinking, and for once she didn't try to work it out. Some things were too private to examine with another person's eyes on you. "All right," he said. She nodded. She went to do the morning chores because they still had to be done, and the snow was still coming down, and the list never got shorter on its own. She gave Vivian money for town the next morning. It was more than Vivian needed for the errands Clara invented, and they both knew it. And they stood in the kitchen with that knowledge between them, like a physical object neither one reached for. Vivian looked at the bills, and then at Clara's face, and something in Vivian's expression shifted. Not guilt exactly, but the recognition of being understood, which was sometimes worse. "There are things I don't know how to want," Vivian said. It was not an apology. It was the most honest thing she'd said to Clara in years. Clara looked at her sister, at the honey-colored hair and the careful posture and the green dress that was wrong for a February morning. She thought about the girl Vivian had been before beauty had become her only currency, before the ranch had become something to escape from rather than something to belong to. "Go into town," Clara said. "Take the long way. The snow's better on the main road." Vivian picked up her coat. She paused at the door. I don't think you'll lose," she said. "I never thought you'd lose. I just didn't think I could afford to wait around to see it." She left. Clara listened to the sound of the wagon leaving the yard, and then she went and got the Remington from the back of the closet where it had lived for 18 months under an oilcloth, and she took it out to the south pasture where the sound wouldn't carry far, and she spent 2 hours relearning its particular character. The pull was a little heavier than she remembered. She adjusted for it by the 3rd round and was consistent by the 10th. The cold was bad for her hands, but the ridge would be worse, and she needed to know now what she'd be managing then. She fired 30 rounds total and called it sufficient. Pete found her walking back from the south pasture and fell into step beside her without asking where she'd been. He'd heard the shots. He looked at the rifle and then at her face. "Tomorrow?" he said. "Yes." I'll have Denny in position by 4. She nodded. Pete started to move off and then stopped. What you did with the herd, he said. Night of the fire. I've been working cattle for 15 years. I wouldn't have gone in that dark after them. Clara looked at him. I knew the ground. I know you did. He looked back at her steadily. That's what I mean. He walked away. Clara continued to the house, unloaded the Remington, cleaned it carefully, and put it beside the door where she could reach it in the dark without searching. Elias brought the confirmation that evening. His contact in town, a man named Garrison, who worked at the land office and owed Elias a debt of the financial variety, had sent word that Crowley had filed a motion in the county court that morning, challenging the survey documentation on the grounds of improper boundary notation. It was a legal maneuver designed to create delay rather than win outright, but delay was its own kind of weapon. In the meantime, Crowley apparently intended to establish physical presence at the spring, to have his men on the site with equipment before any court could sort out the paperwork. He's not waiting anymore, Elias said. No. Clara had expected this. The fire, the legal motion, and the physical move, it was escalation on 3 fronts at once. The strategy of a man who'd done this before and knew that most people couldn't hold 3 lines simultaneously. When? Garrison says the filing has a specific implementation note. 2 days. Tomorrow, then, before he expects us to be ready. Elias pulled a chair out and sat down. He looked tired, which was one of the few times she'd seen him look anything other than collected. There were circles under his eyes that hadn't been there in October, and his coat needed mending at the left shoulder seam where she'd noticed it pulling last week. He was not, she thought, a man who appeared tired from doing nothing. He'd been carrying his share of this quietly and consistently for months, and she'd been so focused on her own weight that she hadn't said much about it. Elias, she said. He looked at her. Thank you for being here, for all of it. She said it without inflection because inflection would have made it feel like something different than what she meant, which was simple and true. I want to say it before tomorrow, in case tomorrow is complicated. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it without arguing. I can try. I came to Redemption Hollow because I needed to put my money somewhere useful, and I'd heard there was good land here. That part's true. He paused. I stayed because of what I found when I got here, not the land. He held her eyes. I want to be clear about that. I'm not being poetic. I'm being specific. Clara looked at the table. She looked at her hands, which were calloused and chapped, and had blood under one nail from a fence wire 2 days ago that she hadn't managed to clean out properly. They were not the hands of a woman a man was supposed to look at and want. She looked at them, and then she looked at Elias, and she said, I don't know how to do this. Do what? This. She gestured vaguely between them, which was imprecise and embarrassing, but was also the most accurate thing she had. I know how to work. I know how to plan and manage and repair. I don't know how to... I've spent so long being invisible that I'm not sure I remember how to be seen. He didn't try to fix that. He didn't say she wasn't invisible or that she'd always been seen or any of the reassuring things that would have been easier and less true. He said, I'm not asking you to be anything different than what you are. I'm saying I see what you are. She sat with that. Tomorrow, she said at last. Tomorrow, he agreed. They were in position before the sky was fully light. Pete and Denny had gone out at 3:30, moving through the dark to their positions on the north and south approaches to the spring. They knew what to do. Make noise, make it sound like more men than there were, drive the sense of being surrounded into anyone coming up the trail. Pete had done enough elk drives to manage the sound of 2 men into something that echoed like 6. Elias was at the creek crossing with a rifle of his own, a Winchester that was newer and cleaner than Clara's Remington. He told her he was a decent shot, and she'd taken him at his word. She didn't need him to be exceptional. She needed him to hold the crossing. Clara was on the ridge. She'd made it up before first light, in the dark. Moving by feel and memory over ground she'd walked her whole life. Her hip was sore from the cold but manageable, and she'd figured out by the time she was halfway up that if she kept her weight slightly right on the descent sections, it redistributed the load enough to give her another hour before it would genuinely interfere. She'd noted that, filed it away, and kept moving. The ridge position was good: rock shelf, chest-high natural cover on 3 sides, clear sight line to the spring approach for 170 yards. She settled in, got the Remington comfortable, and waited. The cold was extraordinary. She'd brought extra cloth for her hands, which she needed, and the metal of the rifle was cold enough through the cloth that she could feel it trying to stiffen her trigger finger. She flexed it every few minutes, slow and deliberate. They came at first light, 5 men on horseback, coming up the east trail, which was what Vivian's information would have told Crowley was the unmonitored approach. Birch was in the lead, which Clara recognized from the one time she'd seen him at the house. Crowley was not among them, which she'd expected. Men like Crowley hired the physical risks out. She let them get to the base of the approach. She let them get far enough that they felt committed to the ground. Then Pete's sound started from the north, the shout, and the movement, and the deliberate noise of what sounded like 8 men moving fast through brush. And from the south, Denny doing the same, and from the creek crossing, Elias's voice carrying clear and cold across the morning air. That's far enough. 3 of the 5 men pulled their horses up immediately. The instinct of men who'd been in enough situations to know when the geometry had turned against them. Birch didn't pull up. He shouted something Clara couldn't make out and pushed his horse forward, and the 2 men flanking him followed. She put the first shot 6 inches to the left of Birch's horse, into the frozen ground, loud and precise, throwing dirt. The horse shied hard, and Birch came within an inch of losing his seat. The second shot went to the right, same distance, same precision, before the echo of the first had fully cleared. In the silence that followed, there was the particular quality of stillness that descends when a group of men simultaneously realizes they don't know where the shooter is, how many shooters there are, or which direction to put their backs to. It was a specific silence. Clara had read about it, and she recognized it instantly. Birch's horse was still dancing. He got it under control and looked at the ridge without finding her. "Last warning," Elias called from the crossing. "The spring is documented and registered. The boundary is legal. Walk off this land now or answer for a criminal trespass charge in Helena." The 2 flanking men were already looking at each other with the expression of employees who had just recalculated how much their wages were worth. One of them said something to the other that Clara couldn't hear. The other one turned his horse around. Birch watched his men go, 1, then 2. Then the 3 who'd held back from the start. He sat alone at the base of the spring approach for a long moment, looking at the ground where the rifle shots had landed, at the crossing where Elias stood, at the ridge where he still couldn't locate Clara. He turned his horse around and rode out. Clara kept the Remington up until she couldn't hear horses anymore. Then she lowered it and let out a breath that she'd been holding in her chest for what felt like the better part of an hour, though the actual engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes. Her trigger hand was shaking slightly. She noticed this without judgment, as useful information about her physical state. She flexed it, rubbed it against her coat, and began the careful process of getting down from the ridge. Pete and Denny were at the base of the spring approach when she arrived. Pete looked at the ground where her shots had landed, then up at the ridge. He did the mental calculation quietly, and then just looked at her with the expression of a man revising an estimate significantly upward. Denny said, "Was that you up there?" "Yes," Clara said. He looked at the ridge again. "I didn't even see you." That was the point. Elias met them at the spring. He looked at Clara the way he had the morning after the fire, that inventory look, checking what it held. She was cold, and her hip was bad, and her trigger hand had stopped shaking mostly. "Birch will go back to Crowley," she said. "Yes. Crowley will know the legal ground is lost and the physical approach was turned back. Yes. He'll try to find another way. He'll try." Elias looked at her. "But this morning changes his calculation. Men like Crowley run numbers constantly. The cost of this fight just went up, and the return is now uncertain. He'll look for an easier target." Clara looked at the spring. The water came up clear through the limestone, the way it always had, cold and consistent, indifferent to who stood over it or what they needed from it. "He burned the barn," she said. "Yes. I want him to answer for that." "I know." Elias looked at her steadily. The legal motion he filed is documented. The trespass this morning is witnessed. Garrison at the land office has been watching his filings. If we build this carefully, over time, there's a real case in Helena. That takes months. It does. He didn't try to sweeten it. I know that's not the same as today. She looked at the burned footprint of the barn, still visible from here. The stone foundation, the black scar in the February snow. The bridle her grandfather had used. The tack she'd maintained and accumulated over 6 years, gone in an hour she'd spent pulling horses out of a burning building. No, she said, it's not. But it was something. It was the beginning of something which was more than she'd had in October when the barn was standing and the ranch was slowly bleeding out and there was no one who was asking the right questions and then actually listening to the answers. She picked up her Remington and started walking back toward the house, and after a moment Elias fell into step beside her, and Pete and Denny behind them. And none of them said much because there wasn't much that needed saying right now, and the snow was still on the ground, and the sky was clear for the first time in days, and Sentinel Creek ran on beside them the whole way back, cold and steady and entirely legally theirs. The days after the confrontation at the spring were quieter than Clara expected, and she didn't trust the quiet. She'd lived long enough on this land to know that silence had different qualities. There was the silence of a problem resolved, the particular stillness that settled after a fence was mended or a sick animal recovered, the silence of something finished. And there was the silence of a problem waiting, the kind that sat in the air like pressure before a storm, where everything looked calm but the grass bent wrong, and the cattle stood grouped in ways they didn't usually stand. The silence after Birch rode away was the second kind. Crowley sent nothing, no letter, no representative, no legal response to the trespass witnesses Elias had already begun compiling with Garrison at the land office. He simply went quiet, and quiet from a man like Marcus Crowley was not peace. It was calculation. Clara kept the Remington beside her door. She told Pete to have someone on watch at the east boundary every night, rotating so no one man bore it 2 nights running. Elias reorganized the temporary tax shelter they'd built after the barn burned, moving the most valuable equipment to the stone outbuilding where fire wouldn't find it as easily. These were not dramatic preparations. They were the ordinary precautions of people who understood that the thing wasn't over. Gerald Hartwell, for his part, had undergone something in the days following the fire and the morning at the spring, a shift that Clara couldn't entirely account for. He'd come out to the burned footprint of the barn the morning after the confrontation, walked the perimeter of the foundation slowly with his hands in his coat pockets, and stood for a long time at the north wall where Pete had found the accelerant pattern in the ash. He hadn't said anything. He'd gone back inside and poured his rye down the kitchen sink, which Clara witnessed by accident from the doorway, and she'd backed away quietly because some moments didn't need a witness. He wasn't a changed man. She had enough history with him not to expect miracles of character. But he was a man who had watched his barn burn and understood, finally, that the thing he was being asked to surrender wasn't just land. It was the only inheritance he'd have to leave, and whatever he wasn't quite ready for that. He told Clara 3 days after the spring confrontation that he'd written to Crowley's lawyer declining the water rights offer, permanently and in writing. He showed her the letter before he sent it. She read it twice, looking for the wording that would give Crowley a foothold, and didn't find one. It was blunt and clear, and signed in Gerald's looping hand. "Pete can take it to town today," she said. "I'll take it myself," Gerald said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the careful steadiness of a man who was deciding something about himself, not just about a letter. She handed it back without comment. He rode into town that afternoon and sent the letter himself, and when he came back, he sat on the porch in the cold for a while before coming inside, and Clara didn't ask what he'd been thinking about because she thought she probably knew. The conversation with Vivian happened on a Thursday, 12 days after the fire. Vivian had been in the house, quiet, careful, occupying the minimum possible space, since the morning Clara had sent her to town with money for errands that didn't exist. She'd come back to find the household intact, and the confrontation at the spring already over, and she'd moved through the following days with the specific quality of someone waiting to be sentenced who doesn't know what the sentence will be. Clara had let her wait. Not out of cruelty, but because she hadn't been ready. She'd needed time to work through her own feelings about it, down to something she could speak from without it becoming something else, anger or grief, or the particular devastation of a sister's betrayal, which felt different from other betrayals in ways she couldn't entirely explain. She found Vivian in the upstairs room that had been their shared bedroom as children, sitting on the window seat with her knees pulled up, looking out at the south pasture. The snow was mostly gone now, just patches in the north-facing shadows, and the grass was the pale tan of early spring trying to happen. Clara sat down on the edge of the bed. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You're not going to tell me you understand," Vivian said finally. Not a question. She knew Clara well enough for that. "No." "Good." Vivian looked at her hands. She'd had her hair down and she'd put it up part way, the way she did when she was trying to be composed and hadn't quite gotten there. "I knew what I was doing. I want you to know that I knew." "I know you knew." "I was going to leave." Her voice was even. "I had it worked out. The money from Crowley's people would have been enough to get to Portland, enough to start something. I had an address from a woman I'd written to, someone who ran a boarding house, someone who took women in who were starting over." She paused. "I was so tired, Clara. I know that's not an excuse. I know what I did. I was so tired of this place and what this place was going to do to me." Clara looked at her sister, at the careful posture and the hair that was half up and the hands that weren't calloused because Vivian had spent her whole life being the beautiful one. And being beautiful was its own kind of exhaustion, and Clara had enough honesty to admit she'd never fully understood what that cost until now. "You told them about the spring," Clara said. "Yes." "You told them about the patrol patterns." "Yes." "People could have been hurt, Vivian, Pete, Denny, Elias." She kept her voice level, which required effort. "Me." Vivian closed her eyes. "I know. I need you to understand that it's not the ranch you put at risk. It's people." "I know." Vivian's voice broke slightly on the word, and she steadied it. "I know, and I don't have anything to offer against that. I made a calculation, and the calculation was wrong, and I'm not going to tell you it felt like anything other than what it was." The room was quiet. Below them they could hear the house settling in the late afternoon, the creak of old wood, the distant sound of Pete at the corral. "What do you want to do?" Clara said. Vivian looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly that. What do you want to do? Not what you think you have to do, not what I'm going to tell you to do." She looked at her sister steadily. "You said you were going to Portland. You had an address. Is that still what you want?" Vivian stared at her. I'm not going to force you to stay somewhere you don't want to be. That never worked out well for either of us." Clara looked at the window, at the south pasture in the thin light of the late afternoon. "I want you to know what you're leaving. I want you to know it clearly, not in the way you've always framed it, as something to escape. The ranch is going to be all right. It's going to be better than all right. You'd have a place here, a real one, if you wanted it." Vivian was quiet. "But if you want Portland," Clara said, "then I'll give you the train fare. I'll give you enough to get there and get settled. And I'd ask that when you write to Papa, you write honestly and regularly, because he's not going to have much time left to hear from you." Vivian looked at her. Her eyes were wet in the way of a woman who'd decided she wasn't going to cry and was winning by a narrow margin. "Why are you doing this?" Clara thought about it. Not the easy answer, the one that sounded right, but the real one. "Because you're my sister, and I love you, and that doesn't stop being true because you did something I can't forgive yet." She paused. "And because I think you've been unhappy here your whole life, and unhappy people make choices that hurt other people. And I'd rather know you were somewhere you could be something other than unhappy." Vivian made a sound that wasn't quite a word and turned back to the window. They sat in the room for a while longer without talking, and it was not a comfortable silence and it was not a resolved silence, but it was an honest one, which was the most they'd managed in years, and Clara counted that for what it was. Vivian left for Portland 6 days later. She hugged Gerald on the porch in the early morning and said something to him quietly that Clara didn't hear and didn't try to. She stood in front of Clara with her traveling bag in her hand and her hair properly done and the green dress packed away in her trunk. "I'm sorry," Vivian said. "I know that doesn't do much." "It does something," Clara said. "Not everything. Something." Vivian nodded. She got in the wagon that Pete was driving to the station. She didn't look back as they went down the road, which was probably better for both of them. Clara stood on the porch until the wagon was out of sight. The morning was cold and clear, and the first real smell of spring was somewhere underneath the chill, not arrived yet but coming. She stood there longer than she needed to, thinking about the girl Vivian had been before beauty became a burden and the ranch became a prison. And she thought you could love someone and grieve them and be relieved and furious all at once, and that all of those things being true simultaneously was just what family was, and there was no clean version of it, and she'd stopped looking for one. Crowley's legal challenge collapsed in March. It collapsed not with any drama, but with the quiet efficiency of a case that had no ground to stand on once the documentation was fully presented. Caldwell's survey was precise. The boundary notation that Crowley's lawyer had challenged as improper was upheld by the district court in Helena after Garrison submitted a supporting affidavit about standard practice. The motion was dismissed. Elias sent the news with a brief note from Helena, where he'd gone to oversee the filing personally. The note was 3 sentences. Clara read it twice, put it in the ledger for the record, and went out to tell Pete. 2 weeks after that, the Helena newspaper ran a piece about Crowley's land acquisition practices in the Bitterroot Valley. A careful, sourced piece that named no specific crimes but drew a clear picture of a man who had used pressure and intimidation to acquire land across the lower valley over 15 years. Garrison had provided some of the sourcing. Elias had provided the rest, accumulated quietly over months through the same kind of attention to detail and patient documentation that Clara used to track fence lines and water levels. The piece didn't put Crowley in a jail cell. The world didn't work that cleanly. But it put his name in print in a way he couldn't control, and in a territory where reputation was a working asset that had real value. 2 ranchers who'd been in negotiations with Crowley pulled back from those conversations. His banker in Missoula became harder to reach. The county sheriff, whose school days friendship with Crowley had been so useful, quietly began to distance himself from that association in ways anyone paying attention could see. Crowley didn't disappear from the valley. Men like him rarely did. But the shape of what he could do shrank, and the places where he could operate in the dark became fewer, and the Hartwell Ranch was no longer on any list he was working from. Pete Doyle said it plainly over supper one evening in late March. He's moved on to easier ground. He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, as a statement of practical fact. "For now," Clara said. "For now's enough," Pete said. She thought about that. For now being enough. She'd spent so long holding against what might come that she sometimes forgot to register what had actually been secured. The spring was documented and legally protected. The barn was going to be rebuilt. The lumber was already ordered, and Abe the carpenter was coming back in April. The herd had wintered better than the previous 2 years. The south fence line was solid. The ledger she'd been keeping for years, the one that showed the real numbers against the numbers her father told people, now showed something that was cautious but not desperate, for now being enough. She was working on believing it. Elias came back from Helena on a Saturday in early April, arriving in the afternoon when the light was going golden and the first real green was showing in the south pasture. Clara was at the corral working with the young mare she'd been breaking since February, a process that had been interrupted by several things and was still not finished because the mare had opinions and Clara respected that. She heard him ride in and didn't stop what she was doing, because the mare needed consistent attention and interrupting her now would mean starting over, and some things didn't pause well. Elias leaned against the corral fence and watched for a while without saying anything. When she finally brought the mare to halt and walked her to the rail, she could feel him looking at her the way she'd felt it since October, and she was still not fully accustomed to it, and she suspected she might not ever be entirely accustomed to it, which was probably fine. "How's Helena?" she said. "Cold. The food at the boarding house was bad." He handed her a folded document over the rail. "Final dismissal. Official." She took it and read it. It said what his note had said it would say, but reading the official language was different. The weight of it, the finality, the specific satisfaction of a thing that had been threatened and had held. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said, "for going. I had reasons to want it resolved." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the directness she'd grown into over the winter, that took some adjusting still but no longer made her want to look away. "The barn goes up in 3 weeks," she said. "Abe tells me 4. I told him 3. We'll see who's right." He smiled at that. The real one, not the small courtesy version. She'd learned the difference around December. "The south pasture looks good," he said. "Better than last year. The pump made the difference in the winter watering." She unclipped the mare's lead. "The cattle are in good condition. The north herd gained weight over the winter, which hasn't happened in 3 years. I know, I've been reading your ledger reports." "I know you have." She paused. "I have one more thing I want to add to the plan." "What's that?" "The east section past the spring. It's been unused because there was never enough water to support it in summer. But now that the spring is legally secured and we have the pump infrastructure, we can run water to the east section by June. That adds approximately 40 acres of summer grazing." He was quiet for a moment, doing the calculation. She'd already done it herself and written it up, and she handed him the paper she'd had in her other coat pocket, the one with the numbers and the routing notes. He read through it slowly. "This is a good plan," he said, looking up. "It's a very good plan," she said, with the same small edge she'd had at the south fence in October. "There's a difference." He laughed. It startled her slightly, the way it still did sometimes. Not that he laughed, but at how much she'd come to want to be the reason for it. "You're right," he said. "It's a very good plan." She took the paper back. The mare bumped her shoulder from behind, impatient, and she reached back and pushed her nose away without looking. "I need to ask you something," Elias said. She waited. "I came here in October to put money somewhere useful." That was true. He rested his forearms on the rail. "What I didn't tell you, because I didn't know how to say it, and also because I hadn't entirely admitted it to myself, is that what I was really looking for was somewhere to stop moving." He paused. "I've been moving since my wife died. 4 years. I kept thinking the next place would be the one where it didn't follow me, and it kept following me. And I eventually understood that wasn't how grief worked, but I kept moving anyway because stopping felt worse." Clara looked at him. He'd never mentioned a wife. She'd guessed, from certain silences, from the way he sometimes looked at the distance with a specific kind of weight, but she'd never asked and he hadn't offered it. "I'm sorry," she said. "What was her name?" "Margaret." He said it without flinching, which she suspected had taken time to achieve. She would have liked this place. She liked land that had a history to it. He was quiet a moment. "I'm not telling you this so I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that when I say I want to stop moving, I mean it with the full weight of what it cost me to get here. It's not a casual thing." "I understand," Clara said. "I want to stay," he said. "Not just in the partnership. I want to stay here, on this land, building what you've been building since before I arrived. I want to do that with you." He looked at her directly. "I know you've spent a long time not being asked for things you actually wanted to give. I'm asking." The mare shifted behind her. Somewhere in the south pasture a meadowlark called, the first one she'd heard since fall, and the sound of it was so exactly like the sound of the world continuing on that it nearly made her chest hurt. She thought about the woman she'd been in October, not a different woman. She didn't believe people became different people, but a woman who had folded herself smaller than she was in order to survive a world that kept telling her she was smaller than she was. The scar, the limp, the invisible work, the years of being Clara, the other one, the capable one, the one nobody particularly noticed. She thought about Vivian on the train to Portland, and her father pouring whiskey down the sink, and Pete Doyle saying you could have been anything and meaning it. She thought about the spring that was legally and permanently theirs. She thought about the east section and 40 acres of summer grazing and the plan in her coat pocket that was very good and that she already knew exactly how to execute. She thought about a man who had looked at a failing fence hinge on the first day and asked the right question and then listened to the answer and had kept asking and kept listening for 7 months across the hardest stretch of years she'd had on this land, which was saying something. "I don't know how to be easy to love," she said. "I want to say that first so you understand what you're asking." "I know. I forget things that aren't the work. I'll be in the middle of a conversation and remember something I needed to write in the ledger, and I'll go write it. I'll be short with you on bad days, and I won't always know how to apologize for it right away. I'll be right about the land more often than you are, and I'll have to manage not saying so every time." "You won't manage it every time," he said. "I've noticed." "No," she admitted. "Not every time." He was watching her with that expression that wasn't pity and wasn't sentiment, just the direct attention of a man who had decided to see you and kept making that decision every time he looked at you. "I also work very hard," she said. "I keep my word. If I say something is going to get done, it gets done. I know this land better than I know most people, and I'll know it better in 20 years than I do now, and I'm a very good shot." She paused. "In case any of that's relevant?" "All of it's relevant." She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at the south pasture with its first thin green, and the line of Sentinel Creek catching the late afternoon light, and the dark rectangle of the barn foundation where, in 3 weeks, possibly 4, there would be new timber going up and the sound of Abe's hammer and the specific satisfaction of a thing lost and rebuilt. "Ask me," she said. "Will you stay beside me while we build this?" "Yes," Clara said, simply, without ceremony, which was how the truest answers usually came. The barn went up in 3 weeks and 2 days, which Clara counted as close enough to winning the argument. Abe worked his methodical way through the structure from the foundation up, and Denny helped, and Pete helped, and Elias and Clara worked alongside them on the days when their other responsibilities allowed, which was not every day, but was most of them. Gerald Hartwell showed up on the 4th day with a hammer he'd dug out of somewhere and worked the morning without being asked, and went inside after lunch without saying much about it, and came back the next morning. He didn't have the stamina he'd once had, and he made mistakes that had to be corrected, but he was there, which was a thing Clara hadn't expected, and she was quietly glad of it. There was a morning in the 3rd week when she was on the upper framing, setting a rafter, and she looked out from that height over the whole of the Hartwell property, south pasture, creek line, north section, the limestone ridge where she'd lain with the Remington in the February cold, the fold in the land where the spring ran clear, the east section that would carry cattle by June. She could see all of it from here in a way she never saw it from the ground. She had a thought on that rafter that she'd carry with her for years, though she didn't have the words for it exactly in the moment. It was something about what you could see when you got high enough, and how most of what she'd spent her life doing had been at ground level, head down, hands moving, solving the problem directly in front of her. And there was nothing wrong with that. It was the necessary work. But from up here, you could see that the necessary work added up to something, that the fence line she'd mended and the water she'd managed and the ledgers she'd kept were not just tasks, but the accumulated shape of something that would outlast her. The ranch would be here after she was gone. The creek would run here. Something she'd kept alive with her hands would go on living without her hands, and then without the hands of whoever came after, and the land didn't care about any of that. It just went on, but the going on was the point. She set the rafter and climbed down. Pete was waiting at the bottom with 2 cups of coffee, the way he had a habit of doing. He handed her one without comment. "You were up there a while," he said. "I was thinking." "I could see that." She drank the coffee. It was too hot and too strong in the way Pete's coffee always was, which had been a complaint of the men on the ranch for 6 years, and would remain one indefinitely, because Pete made the coffee and wasn't going to change. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. It wasn't something she'd asked him before. He thought about it seriously, which was his way. "Sometimes. When it's hard." He looked at the frame of the barn rising against the clear spring sky. "But I've been here long enough that leaving would feel like leaving myself somewhere. And I've done that once, when I was young, and it didn't turn out to be as clean as it seemed." She understood that, more clearly than she'd understood it in October, or even in February. Leaving yourself somewhere, trying to find a place where the hard parts of you didn't follow. "Your sister sent a letter," Pete said. Clara looked at him. Already? Apparently she got there in good shape. Says the boarding house is decent and she has a lead on work. He paused. She asked Pete, who brought the letter, to give it to you personal, not your father. Clara thought about that. Vivian choosing who to tell first, who to trust with the news of her arriving somewhere. It wasn't forgiveness, not between them, not yet. Forgiveness was a longer road than a single letter, and Clara wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But a letter was a letter. A letter was Vivian saying, I arrived, I'm here, I haven't disappeared. A letter was the beginning of something that might, given enough time and honesty, become something they could both live with. She'd write back that evening. She'd write something true and brief and leave space for the harder conversations to come in their own time. Thusy, in May, when the east section was running water from the extended pump line and the new barn stood solid and smelling of fresh lumber and the first calves of the season were on the ground. In the south pasture, the town of Redemption Hollow began to notice the Hartwell Ranch in a different way than it had before. It was incremental, the way most real changes were. Hector Flynn at the saloon mentioned to someone that he'd heard the Hartwell operation had turned itself around. Mabel Reardon revised her understanding of events so thoroughly that by June she was telling people she'd always known Clara Hartwell was the one holding that place together, said so all along. The men who'd sold their water rights to Crowley under pressure, who'd watched a woman with a rifle from a ridge turn back 5 armed riders at a spring they'd never legally owned, told the story in ways that grew with each telling but didn't lose the essential shape of it. Clara didn't pay much attention to what people were saying. She had a list of things to do, and the list didn't get shorter because the town had revised its opinion of her. What she paid attention to was the work and the land and the ledger that now showed 3 consecutive profitable months. Small margins, cautious ones, but real. And the conversation she had with Elias most evenings about the east section and the herd expansion and whether the north fence needed to be moved in the spring and 100 other things that were the actual substance of a life on this ground. She paid attention to the way the meadowlarks came back in April and the way the creek ran higher in May than it had in 4 years, and the way the mare she'd been breaking finally settled into being ridden with something that wasn't quite trust yet, but was moving in that direction. She paid attention to her father, who was not a transformed man but was a present one, in a way he'd stopped being for years. He came out to the barn in the morning sometimes and stood watching the work without needing to direct it or take credit for it. He talked to Pete about cattle with a specificity she hadn't heard from him in a long time. He wrote to Vivian every week without being reminded. He sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the south pasture in the way of a man who was counting what he still had rather than tallying what he'd lost. She paid attention to Elias, who kept his word about staying and who learned the specific character of the land the way you could only learn it by being present through all its seasons, the way the creek ran in spring versus August, the way the north section drained differently after rain, which cattle needed watching and which could be trusted. He was not a man who'd been raised to this, and he made mistakes that she corrected without apology, and he took the corrections the way she took them from the land itself, as information, as adjustment, as the necessary process of understanding something real. He kept a journal she wasn't invited to read, and she respected that. He had mornings where the grief for Margaret was visibly present, and she learned to be near him on those mornings without trying to fix it, because some things weren't fixable, they were just carried. And the best you could do for someone carrying something was be nearby. She was not always easy. She told him the truth about that and kept telling it with her actions. There were evenings she was short and didn't apologize until the next day, and evenings he was closed off in ways she didn't know how to reach, and days when the weight of the work and the history of the place and the accumulated years of doing everything herself rose up in her like a tide she couldn't reason with. Those days happened. She stopped expecting them not to. What she'd learned through the winter and the spring and the slow building of something between 2 people who both came to it with damage and history and the particular stubbornness of people who'd survived things on their own, what she'd learned was that love built on honest ground held differently than love built on performance. It wasn't smoother. It was rougher in some ways because honesty created friction that politeness smoothed over, and friction meant feeling the edges of another person, their actual contours rather than the version they presented. But it held. It held in ways that mattered when the pressure came. She thought about Vivian choosing beauty as currency and spending it until it couldn't buy what she actually needed. She thought about her father choosing whiskey over hard truths until the hard truths found him anyway. She thought about Crowley, who had accumulated land by erasing other people's hold on it and who had ended up with nothing he hadn't scared someone out of, which was a particular kind of loneliness she'd never wish on herself. And she thought about herself at 16 with the Remington, learning from her grandfather that a tool worked the same regardless of who was holding it, which was the most useful thing anyone had ever told her, and which she'd spent 11 years applying to everything from fence wire to financial ledgers to the particular challenge of being seen. The world would tell you what you were. It would do it from the time you were born. The scar, the limp, the wrong sister, the invisible one, the capable one, which was the word people used when they meant useful but didn't mean valuable. The world was very certain about these classifications and very consistent, and if you weren't careful, you'd eventually believe it. What Clara Hartwell had discovered on a south fence line in October with a man who asked good questions and actually listened to the answers was that the world's certainty about you was not the same as the truth of you. It was just the story people told because it was easier than paying attention. And you could spend your whole life being the story, or you could be the person, the actual person, with the ledger and the plan and the rifle and the hip that hurt in the cold and the capacity to love people who had disappointed her without losing either the love or the disappointment. She chose the person. She kept choosing it, the way Elias said he kept choosing to see her. Not once, not as a declaration, but as a daily decision made in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life on particular ground. The barn stood. The creek ran. The east section greened up in June exactly the way her numbers said it would, and she wrote it in the ledger without ceremony, as a fact among other facts, which was how the best things arrived. Not announced, not dramatic, just present and true, and already becoming the ground for what came next. Clara Hartwell didn't become a legend in any way she would have recognized from the stories people told later. She became something quieter and more durable than that. She became someone who knew exactly what she was worth and did the work anyway, not to prove it to anyone, but because the work was the point and the land was real and some things were worth the cost of keeping them. That was enough. That had always been enough. It just took a long time and the right questions and someone willing to stand at a failing fence post and see it for what it actually was.